pops in, and I've had so many really interesting, enlightening conversations with him. He has over 20 years of experience in the biotech industry, and some really interesting stories working as an ethnobotanist, speaking with indigenous people and investigating native medicines in Amazonian dryland forests of northeastern Peru. Did I get that right?
A blend.
A blend, okay.
A blend rainforest, but
Rainforest, okay.
get the idea. South America.
South America, got it. Okay. So these are my distinguished guests. I am very blessed and very honored to have them make the drive here this early in the morning. And they have a lot to teach us from their years of experience. So real quickly, I'm going to start on this side of the room. And please introduce yourself. And I don't want to run out of time.
Oh, right. Hi, Mary Rockenstein, attorney, law professor, and on the BioTech board with Canada.
Yeah, Tom Hill, I'm a process development director at Amgen, and here's for general interest.
Thank you.
I'm Christine Forbes. I work as a file clerk at a local law office, and I'm also on the board.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm a delineator. I'm a molecular biologist working in a series. Yeah, series, very close.
I'm Ellie Rarescheid. I am a graduate student at Cal State Northwestern Archaeology.
Greg Coach?
Engineering background. Yes, I used to be an engineer and I designed wind farms.
Oh.
So.
Greg Koshan, I'm the director of the Ventura Biocenter. So welcome everybody.
Yes, and Greg, if we have time, you'll find David tour of the facility. This place is packed with millions of dollars of really cool lab equipment. No, you're not allowed to take it. These things that you read about, the peer-reviewed articles, they use to, isotope analysis and all that stuff. This is the equipment they use to do that analysis. That's really exciting stuff.
I'm Andrew Porterfield. I run my own marketing communications firm serving mostly healthcare and biotech.
Bill Pratt, VP of Operations for Kinemed.
I'm Loretta Longhetto. I'm a lawyer at Glaser Weil and a former colleague of Steve Hobson's group.
Narrow it down.
I'm Ken Neeson. I'm a botanist. I work at Chandler Islands National Park. I work mostly on endangered species and invasive species monitoring and mapping.
Ron Perkovich, I'm Miss Terry's driver. But actually what caught my attention, I'm a dairy farmer from northern Wisconsin originally. And I thought maybe I could teach you on how to grow corn in 12 below zero weather. Future.
Climate change, you never know.
Yeah.
Crazy weather here.
With a hair dryer?
Yeah.
I am Terry Quick, and I work for Ventura County Library. And we are in the process of seeing if we fit into the picture. Yeah. Or if we can collaborate in some fashion.
Awesome. Very cool.
I'm John Suarez, a concerned citizen who welcomes the opportunity to be educated.
Thank you.
I'm Sheila Suarez, and I second what my husband says.
Rarely, but.
And authors as well from the last one, writing about animals.
Oh, no.
I've authored things, but not about animals.
Okay.
Mostly about humans.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jim Zonlo, and we started BioSpring here at the Bio Center. We're a DNA cloning, protein expression, and characterization group.
I'm Joni Blackster. I'm the chapter leader for the Ventura chapter of the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is a 501c3 nutrition foundation, and I'm also a health coach.
Laura?
Laura Jones, Ventura Biocenter, your servant, and whatever you need for today.
Jeffrey Whitehurst, Rock, you're dragging me along.
Ron Whitehurst, Greenhouse by Tobin Secretaries, and local coordinator for the Label GMO campaign.
I'm Carol Vaseski. I have a mulberry farm in the Ojai Valley, and I also represent grow bioinvestment. I have a project on biointangible.
Very cool. I'm Eleanor Howe. I'm a human interested in learning. Yay, Sprinkles Organic Farm, and I'm excited to be here. Cool.
Patty Jones, also concerned citizen, also work for the real Steve Sprinkle.
Uh-oh.
I'm Mike Newman. I'm here because I have a seed business in Camarillo. I've known Steve Sprinkle for many years, and I came to make sure there was at least one person here to listen to him.
Thank you so much.
And I'm Amanda Kroll, and I'm so happy to see so many people show up today. This is the last one of, I believe, 12 of our seminars. So we're gonna regroup for to do a new series, but it'll be in a little bit different coming up. I'm really grateful to look around the room and see presenters like Michael Newman and Mary Rockenstein and Laura Jones, who've all presented before you guys. I'm really excited about this panel that Angela Kerwin has cooked up. And I just want to say that a lot of people wrote me and said they would love to be here. They would love to see an archive of this. So what I have done is asked my son, Maxwell Vulcan, here to videotape. And it looks like Ron is also preparing a document. What I need from you guys, if you would, is make sure you're signed in. And I have a little box here. I'm going to pass this around again. So if you're willing, if you can go ahead and check your name off, then we'll be good to publish this. If you're not, just write no next to the box, so I'm sure that you didn't just forget. Okay, so I'm going to pass this around one more time for anybody who didn't sign in, or more importantly, is to check the box that I put in, that it's okay to videotape. Thanks.
Thank you, Panda. And I want you guys to know that without Panda, we wouldn't be here today. So she's very much instrumental in putting these seminars together that enriched us. So again, my electronic mouse doesn't work. So I'm going to ask my dear panelist, John, to change it. And yes, please. Okay. And then I think I'll just do a hand signal. I'll just go like that. Okay. So we're going to talk about 5 different things today. We're going to breeze through it a little bit. We're running a little bit late. But first of all, just introduce the panel myself, which I sort of already did, so that'll save us some time. Then I'm going to define cultural property and heritage for the non-anthropologists in the room. Anybody who's an anthropologist, archaeologist in the room? All right, so there's 4 of us. So for the rest of you, you might find this interesting and not basic. And then I'm just going to go over kind of the cultural context of intellectual property law and patents as they relate with plants. I am not an attorney, so please correct me if I get anything wrong. And I'll be just getting more of the cultural context of it anyway, rather than legal part of it. And then I'm going to talk about 3 different kind of stories that represent some of the issues when you combine cultural heritage, a collective experience and related to people's identity, with commerce and law. And then finally, I'm going to finish off with some possible solutions. So here's my panel for those of you who came in a little bit later. My first panelist is Dr. Steve Bobson. He has over 20 years of experience working in the biotech industry in many different capacities. He has worked with international agreements, memorandums of understanding, managed patents, has done investigative work on looking for different plants and animals that could have market value as a future pharmaceutical or crop. And most lately, he's worked in the biofuels research, which is really exciting stuff. And then my other panelist here is John Foster. He's an archaeologist, and he's my kind of cultural expert. And also in anthropology, very often, if you want to get a balanced view, you have to have everyone be able to speak at the table. And I couldn't get a Chumash to come, or an indigenous person, so he has spent his entire life working with indigenous people and their artifacts And there's probably no one in this room that knows more about other ways of perceiving things and different technologies that were used for food and crops and medicines before Europeans came to this continent. And then finally, I have Steve Sprinkle. He's an organic farmer, seed saver in Ojai. He's kind of a local legend up in Ojai. He's done a lot for organic activism and a lot of education work, helping people learn how to farm more sustainably and using more ecological processes. And then here's me. Who am I? What am I doing here? I'm doing this seminar as part of my education effort for a nonprofit foundation that I co-founded with my husband in 2005. We do disaster relief and education development projects. It's a Kerwin International Relief Foundation, or otherwise known as KERF. And in the last, since 2005, almost 9 years ago, we've done 7 major disaster relief projects in Hurricane Katrina. We've worked with local nonprofits and communities, most recently in the Philippines. And we're a charity. We're not a proper foundation. We've raised money from local groups like Ventura Rotary and some medical groups who take pharmaceuticals out to places where there's need, based on what the individuals in need say they need. So, and then we've done over 15 educational programs, everything from a tsunami orphan scholarship that we first started in 2005, which, working in Thailand and currencies and really different people, as you can imagine, took 2.5 years to get that going to make sure the money didn't disappear. So when it comes to working in developing countries, pretty comfortable at it. Okay, so again, my lens, my perspective is culture. So I'm going to look at these issues of when biotechnology and commercialized biotechnology hits heritage and tradition. When they collide together, I'm going to look at it through a cultural lens. There's 3 components of culture. There's ideational. An example of ideational component is the ideology of how people believe things are the way they are. In science, you have the scientific method. You have a belief. You have evolution, the paleoarchaeological record of human evolution. But you have other forms of knowledge and different types of perspectives. Some First Nations groups believe that their evolution, or they're in a very different worldview of how they came to be than a scientific view. And then there's beliefs about what people believe is good food and bad food. My undergrad research, much of that was on the beliefs of endurance athletes about food. And it was really interesting because they have a very scientist viewpoint. But then I tracked how advertising and marketing manipulated that viewpoint. So even though they believed in natural foods, but then they would take supplements where there's all the ingredients you can't really pronounce. So you see that dichotomy there. And then how food is so tied into our identity. There's people that I know that if you ask them if they were really hungry, would they entertain eating something that was genetically modified? I'm like, no way. You could explain to them that, well, chemically it's identical, there's nothing wrong with it, but it might, and I wouldn't explain that to them because I understand and I respect their view. Because what we eat is part of identity the same way as if we keep kosher, the same way as if we don't eat pork, or we don't eat things that are prohibited under halal culture. That's part of our identity, and it doesn't really matter what the science is because it's who we are. You hear that quote, "I'm so hungry I could eat a horse." Everybody raise their hand, who has eaten a horse here?
Not intentionally.
Who would never eat a horse?
Does calls apply?
Exactly. And I just saw a presentation. Horse meat actually is more nutritional, less fatty than cow meat. But against most of our culture to eat a horse, especially if you ride horses, you know, you ride cows, whatever. But, so, okay, behavioral, what people do. One of my research projects was showing how our biology, what we've inherited, our stress reactions. I was looking at triathletes when they get really stressed out, even though they know they need to eat healthy food, when the glucocorticoids start, their endocrine system starts throwing all those stress hormones in their body, they will binge on beer carbs. So it shows how even if you know it's something's bad for you, you'll do it anyway. So it's behavior and gender roles and farming techniques, things that are, again, a part of our identity. All these components of culture are part of our identity. Material, what people have, markers of status, everything we're wearing, things we own, all show our parts of our identity. So anytime you want to make a change in the culture, you really have to work with all three of these elements of culture. They're what people believe, how they behave, and what they own. So if you want to change farming practices, for example, from maybe a traditional technique to more of some innovative techniques, if people are going to stop and go, no, that's bad, you won't even get past the ideational section until you change their thinking before you can change their behavior, before you can change what they do, what they own. Does that make sense? So cultural property. What does that mean? All right, tangible cultural property is heritage. It's things you can see, material things. And on this screen, I just kind of gave you kind of a history, a little context of what cultural properties are. Example is the White House. If the Obamas get really down on their luck, too much credit card debt, do you think they could start renting out rooms in the White House? No. Why not? Why can't the Obamas start renting out rooms in the White House?
It doesn't belong to them.
Exactly. Who does it belong to?
Us.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. If Queen Elizabeth, she's somehow makes some really bad investment decisions, can she, you know, start throwing weddings at Buckingham Palace? No, but she can do it at Balmoral Castle, which is a 50,000-acre estate that her grandfather purchased in the 1800s. She owns that, but she does not own Buckingham Palace. You guys get it. Cultural property are things that the nation or group owns as part of their identity. So what's intangible cultural property? This is where it gets tricky and a little bit more fraught with controversy. These are non-material forms that represent people's heritage and identity. Pueblo Indian sacred medicine dances, maybe religious services in a Catholic church. You try copyrighting them, you can't. Don't, because you didn't invent them. They don't belong to you. They belong to the culture, right? The American flag, the symbols of America. There's the Zio Pueblo sun symbol. You know that. Anyone kind of recall what the New Mexico flag looks like? Yeah, there was a huge, big legal battle with the Zio Pueblo Indians about using what they felt was their cultural property, their symbol, to represent the state of New Mexico. Because they said that New Mexico is an appropriating part of the imperial power of the nation United States, using their First Nations, their symbol represents them, to represent the greater geographic area of New Mexico. They had a problem with that. Eventually they worked it out with the flag. So I think and so UNESCO actually was really interesting. During the kind of natives and cultural movements of the post-colonial era, when Latin American countries and African countries were getting their freedom, in the 1960s, Vietnam got away from, no longer was owned by France and so on. This was kind of this trend in the global community of equalizing the power of former colonial countries, and the UNESCO Cultural Heritage List came out of that. And generally, these lists are intangible cultural properties that the people or somebody in those countries or groups felt are threatened. I put some of the cultural properties up on this screen because I found some of them almost maybe absurd because I don't understand it, but I don't know. Mexico considers traditional Mexican cuisine endangered. It needs to be protected as a cultural property. How many Mexican food places are here in California? You know?
2 million.
A million. Subway, you can't even find non-Mexican food. We're not even Mexico, right? What? But traditional.
How many of them are cooking authentically, though?
Yeah, exactly. And authentically, exactly. And thanks. Yeah, and I want this interactive, so please jump in. The tango is, the proper traditional tango is endangered in Argentina. The Mediterranean diet, this is like Greece and the Mediterranean countries said that was endangered, and Georgian winemaking. Okay, we can change the other slide. So biological and tangible cultural properties. I have two, there are many different kinds, but I have two that we're going to discuss today. One's horticultural heritage. These are plant-based foods, crops, and medicines. And I put some up here that you may not be aware of that were ayuska. Anyone familiar with that? It's a hallucinogenic herb used by many different Amazonian tribes for rituals and for non-Amazonian tribe people to party with. I don't know how else to put it. And I think in 1997 or early 90s, an American man patented it. And boy, that was a ruckus. He said, this is part of their identity, this ayuska, it's part of their sacred ritual. It's like patenting, I don't know, the wafers you use in a Catholic service. It's like, you can't do that, you can't patent that. And so that was kind of the linchpin points, one of the key points where a lot of these indigenous activists and advocates for their rights got up in arms against patent law, of patenting some of their medicine, or derivatives of some of their medicines that and food crops that they've had in their cultures for generations. There was another American man who patented a strain that was derived from basmati rice, which was fine in the United States, but the Indian government refused to recognize it. So you have cross-cultural issues there for sure. And then the last thing we're talking about is human DNA. This was BioTech. It was the first drug approved by the FDA with a race-specific designation in 2005. If you have a cultural background, you know that race is not really a biological category, it's a political, social category. And that I found most interesting. There's a lot of drug companies who patented, looks like this is, for example, a heart rate medicine, for example, the patent was about to expire. And then they do another study, the same medicine, they call it something else, and they do the study with a sample of people of a certain ethnic group to extend the patent for that group. I mean, nothing's changed. It's almost like a marketing business ploy. It's not really. And so that, again, you're having commerce intersecting with raw science, and I think that's very interesting. Cultural property dilemmas. Cultural is heritage group. It's a paradox. You have the word property, you're thinking, well, what is property? It's things we own. But culture is an abstraction of the practices of a group, and it's identified by beliefs, and it's collective. And it's priceless. You can't really put a price on culture. Well, I guess no, you can't. And then property has a market value and it's individualized. You either own it or you don't. So a lot of times when they have these ethnic medicines, alternative medicines that are found in maybe European, goes to Argentina, and they said, well, let's patent it, make it into a medicine, we'll sell it in Europe, but we're going to pay the indigenous group that we founded that's been using it for hundreds of years. Then another group says, hey, well, we've been doing it too. Well, who do they pay? Who's the true cultural representative of this group? And then if they say they're going to pay, then is anybody here, I mean, a lot of you already here work in the Amgen and the pharmaceutical industry. It takes up to 10 to 15 years to get a chemical compound from finding it in the forest or finding it in the lab all the way to an approved prescription drug. And if it doesn't make it through that process, then you don't have it, and then you've just sunk, what, $500 million for nothing? But the indigenous groups don't understand that. They're like, well, where's our royalties? We helped you, you know, we added value to this compound. We told you about this. And then they say, well, we never made a drug out of it. Now these are the same indigenous people that have been screwed over by colonial powers for hundreds of years. Are they going to believe the scientists? They might not. So you see these cultural differences come into play. And intellectual property law. Here's applied living things. This is something I found out that was interesting for you non-lawyers out there. We've been patenting living things since 1930, and the first patents, intellectual property, were many of them all the way back down into the mid-1800s on strains of cattle and trademarking fruit and vegetable varieties. So we have a long history with patenting living things. It's not something that's happened 10 years ago. That's what's interesting. Thanks, John. So I'm going to touch on 3 different scenarios right now that kind of illustrate things that can go wrong and things that can go right when you mix heritage, tradition with science and commerce. First one is the ICBG project in Peru. Steve, you were a participant in that project?
Yes, I was.
Steve, do you mind talking about it?
Sure. Heck, it was only 20 years ago. It should just come right off the top of my head.
Want me to give you a slide? What you did?
Yeah, I'll read your slide for you.
I just think he could say it better because he was there. He was there, and he could talk about it.
All right, so what I know about this project, I worked for Monsanto Company in the 90s. I worked for their pharmaceutical division, never worked for the agricultural company. And in the mid-90s, we had established, the research group I worked in had established a collaboration with a ethnobotanist at Washington University in St. Louis. Monsanto's headquarters are also in St. Louis. And Walter, at the time, Walter was already probably 70 and had been working with this tribe of native people in the upper Amazonian basin in Peru, not in Brazil, but all the way upstream in the mountains in Peru. And he'd been working with them for literally 25 or 30 years, basically his whole career. And he had been working with them, gaining their trust, learning their language, learning their culture, and learning the plants and herbs and products that they used in their culture for medicine. And we established a collaboration with Walter and with the Agaruna Indians to try to identify what were the chemical constituents in some of these plants and herbs that were actually responsible for their anti-inflammatory activity or anti-infective activity, etc. And we actually wrote together a grant, got funded by the US government to do this work, and we were one of the very first groups to actually forge a 3-way agreement with a group of tribes. It wasn't just the Agarunas, there were several other tribes, but as Angela was referring to, who do you really negotiate with? You know, I mean, when you're there's no, it's not a government entity that you're negotiating with. It's a very nebulous group of peoples, and who's really given the authority to say, yes, you can use our cultural property, and here is the agreement that I'm signing off on, that we will get reciprocated, we will get paid for this in a way that's fair. And we were very, from my perspective, progressive at the time with this project, but that did not protect us from getting crucified in the press, and that's probably because Monsanto's name was associated with it and it was a good corporate target. But the scientists, myself, Walter, and the other people in my research group that were involved with the project all felt that we were trying to do this to the best of our abilities to make it fair to everybody involved. Because in the past, what generally happened is companies or researchers would go to the Peruvian Department of Agriculture, find somebody that they knew to give them a permit. Maybe it involved a couple $1,000s under the table, and they just got an import-export permit, came in and grabbed the materials and left, and had absolutely no strings attached after that. And we were trying to do something that would return some benefit back to the culture of these Indians. As Angela noted, the timeline for this type of research is very long. The other thing is the likelihood of its success is very, very low. And so I think people at this very early discovery stage often have, I'd say, unrealistic expectations as to the value of that first bit of knowledge or that first bit of information that's the initial lead. The number of hurdles to get it actually all the way through to an approved drug are numerous, very pricey, and again, taking a long time. To my knowledge, nothing ever came out of that project. Some good research, we identified some interesting compounds that looked good in the lab, but as soon as they went any further into animal models and testing for that disease, they fell out. So anything else?
No, that was good. So I think that everyone kind of sees some of the issues. A lot of the issues were cultural and cross-cultural as well, yeah.
I just want to share, I just went to a BioTech International conference and I was shocked because, Steve, you just said that there's a lot of hurdles and it's very expensive to get a drug to market. I had no idea. My understanding is it takes $1 billion?
I think that's about the latest. Latest raw number I saw was 800 million from a Tufts University study, but that's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old now, and it may have been updated and it's $1 billion now. And that's on average.
Yeah, it depends on the therapeutic area.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a lot. It has to do with it. It's really carving out new practice of medicine. It has much less to do with technology and chemicals. How do you really do something which impacts the doctor's behavior?
Yep. The clinical trials are where there's huge costs involved. I mean, there's huge costs in research and discovery of candidates. But the costs kind of go this way as you go towards getting closer to the market.
A successful antibiotic, a new antibiotic last resort would only take 1,500 patients in the clinic, but a heart medicine would take 40,000 patients.
And what's the potential profit if it's successful?
It's very hard to say. The cost is much higher than the numbers you heard here. So.
One thing I found interesting in my research, and you know this better than I do, is that our human variation, our adaptations of our ancestors interact with drugs a little differently. So
for sure.
And so if you have 40,000 sample, who are these people? And maybe it might work for some of them and not for others. And what are the factors where it doesn't work for the others, based on their biological heritage?
Just to try to give you an answer to the question about how much can be made. So, some of the top 10 selling drugs may sell $3, $4, $5 billion a year at a profit that's probably profitable, I don't know, 50% of that, $1 billion profit a year. So the prize is big, which motivates the investment. Because the investment is huge, the risk is huge.
Huge risk generates huge profits when you're successful. You're going to be risking that.
It's the only way that it makes sense from a business point of view. And I'm not here to defend the corporate or business point of view in all cases, because sometimes that profit can become too big of a carrot for making good decisions for cultural property or other things.
Yeah, part of the problem with this is trying to identify, taking Western concepts of ownership and property and applying them to indigenous peoples. And part of the issue with that is that a lot of the indigenous groups don't recognize property in any fashion that's similar to what we see. So what they see as a communal, something you can't own, the private ownership, for instance, in the early Chumash period in this region, they didn't recognize the fact that you had private ownership of property until late into their cultural history when they got into contact with the Spanish. So what you have is a foreign concept. So when you say, we're going to pay you for this, they don't understand the language. It isn't even in their language to understand these kinds of concepts. So when you go to them and say, we want to buy this or something like this, they don't understand it as that part of the concept. They have a holistic way of looking at the environment and culture that they live in. Everything is intertwined. So how do you sell their culture, their history, their environment? It becomes a very difficult issue of just trying to communicate. In the United States, under federal law, we have the traditional cultural properties under the National Historic Protection Act of 1966. And it defines that you have to take into consideration the indigenous or traditional groups, and that doesn't apply just to Native Americans, but you have to take into account and consideration their feelings and their regard for particular issues that might affect their properties. Mount Shasta was one particular recent issue where there was going to be a project there, and the indigenous people in the area protested that, but they got into immediate conflict because they couldn't understand why this piece of property could be owned. They didn't agree that it could be owned in the first place. So it led to a large number of conflicts in that regard. There was another issue too with some of the cultural issues involved with indigenous people, and that is that the very idea of telling you that a particular area is sacred or a environmental area or the spirits or something like this are involved would violate their own religious trust, and as a consequence they would be destroying the very thing that they would be trying to protect. So by using Western concepts of law and property, then we get into issues about whether or not the indigenous people actually are even going to tell you the truth about what is there, or if they'd be violating their own sacred trust by doing so.
Yeah, look at the historical context. Why should they trust you if you're not one of them, indigenous, as a Westerner?
And then we're talking about a cultural context, and so a lot of these medicines work very nicely in a cultural context. And then we're also looking at, from a holistic medicine standpoint, the biochemical context of a particular compound. We identify a particular compound as the active ingredient in these medicines, but it could be a whole host of compounds, and compounds that act synergistically in combination in the whole plant. So there's immediately a whole problem of taking a whole plant and then taking out one compound and saying, this is the medicine.
You were absolutely right on that, and that's what my experience tells me as well, being in the field of natural products chemistry and doing this type of work is, we're taking this information about we boil this plant and make a tea out of it and drink it, and that makes us feel better for whatever ailment we have, or we crush up these leaves and wipe it on open wounds, and that keeps it from being becoming infected. And we try to pound that knowledge into our mold of a single purified chemical entity that is put into a pill, right? And you're exactly right. What really ends up being the case is when you look at many of these plants, it's not a single magic ingredient in there. It's a combination of things working together for a variety of reasons. And you start pulling it apart, and you lose the biological activity that you initially had. And what we found is that it was it was very useful to have that knowledge, but often you found things that were not related to the knowledge. And what you were really accessing was the genetic diversity producing the chemical diversity inside the plant. And this chemical diversity is things that chemists in the lab don't even dream about, these things these natural products that nature has synthesized within the plant and selected for some reason, interaction with biological targets, you know, whether it was preventing ants from eating them or preventing fungus from infecting the tissue or whatever. And in many cases, there can be things found. I mean, there's certainly, you know, something like 25% of pharmaceutical sales today still can harken back to a lead found from natural sources, whether it's microbial or plant or other sources. Aspirin is, you know, over the counter. I think a lot of people know that was originally found as a lead from willow bark, and people had used, many cultures had used willow bark as a treatment for inflammation, and that's the origins of aspirin. And there's cancer drugs, there's many cancer drugs actually, many anti-infectives, penicillin, etc. But your point, you're right on with that comment.
Which sounds like one of the best arguments I've ever heard for not genetically modifying any organism anywhere on the planet.
Well, preserving the genetic diversity of all the organisms that we have left on the planet, I think should be a very, very high priority. Absolutely. Because we will never recreate that. Once it's gone, it's gone.
It also seems like the sort of adaptive relationship between an indigenous people as we've been using a specific plant over time would provoke a specific outcome in terms of how effective it is as a treatment, and that relationship isn't something that you can just recreate in the lab.
Yeah, there's holistic elements too. Like, Thomas. Yeah, and having those behaviors for the medicine to work and the therapies to work, and then put it into the biomedical American system. And then as you said something about when you have a new therapy or new treatment, a new pharmaceutical, it requires behavior change. So again, we're talking about culture. You have to get doctors to do something a little different. You have to get the whole distribution channel to do something different. So. Anybody else?
Well, there's just one last.
Okay.
The purpose for patents is specifically so that knowledge doesn't remain secret inside of private companies. So while it costs billions of dollars for the innovator to bring something to market, it's a trivial cost for somebody to then bring it to market at the end of that 15 or 20-year patent life. And then many, many people bring it to market. And it becomes available for the entire planet to use at a very competitive low cost. It actually expanding the value of that drug well beyond that upfront incentive to create it in the first place. So patents are not about protecting property. Patents are about making sure that knowledge and creativity is spread across the planet for all people at the end of 20 years. All you're buying is a little bit of a head start, and that head start is very expensive. It's very expensive up front for the innovation, the risks, the losses, the regulatory scrutiny. Every government has their hand in the pocket. I mean, if you go into pharmaceuticals, you have more partners than you can believe. And when you really get down, what is the benefit? It's, after all is said and done, you know, I think you might be better off making video games.
One thing to consider is that when you patent a drug, that's at the beginning of your clinical cycle. So if you've got 15 years to bring it to the clinic, and your patent runs for 20 years, you only have patent protection. What's your market? So that really makes the gamble.
You know, I didn't think of that. If you do your clinical trials for 3/4 of that period, then you have 5 years to push it out there with your marketing, where you can monopolize it legally.
Steve can check my theory of conspiracy, but back in the 90s, a lot of us in the anti-GMO movement had learned that one of the reasons that Roundup herbicide, which was a solely owned patented material by Monsanto, was one of the first items out of the gate with genetically modified agriculture was because their patent was going to run out. And so they could protect that, and then they loop that back in the patenting process with the technology, not the material, the herbicide itself, but the patenting of the process to modify the soybean so it could be herbicide tolerant. So then when the patent ran out on the chemical, they still had the proprietary process for modification. And so then now there are a lot of different kinds of Roundup herbicide or glyphosate out there, but you can't use that technology unless you obtain it from Monsanto.
And Stephen, I think you have the facts right.
Okay.
You know, whether it was conspiracy or whether it was opportunistic, taking opportunistic advantage of the discoveries that were made, you know, I don't know either. My understanding is that the glyphosate resistance gene was found somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, just by luck. And they essentially found it by identifying a bacteria that was surviving in the wastewater from one of their glyphosate production facilities. And this bacteria was making a gene that made it resistant to glyphosate. And they thought, we're learning how to put genes into plants. What would happen if we isolated this gene out of this bacteria and put it into a plant? And that's exactly the history as I understand it. And then they started thinking, you know, this would be nice, putting our lead chemical product together with this whole product line. And this would provide a value to the farmer, which I think has been proven that there's value to the farmer, at least by virtue of, I think it's somewhere around 90% of the corn that's cultivated today is Roundup ready. You know, that is not because Monsanto said it will be. It's because farmers have said, I want that. You know, it makes growing my crop easier. And to date, to my knowledge, there are no proven health effects or ills that have been directly correlated to the use and the consumption of Roundup Ready corn. But all the facts are right. It's just how you interpret it and in what sort of context you look at the evidence.
The yield data doesn't support, you know, that there's value to the farmer, that after the first couple of years of benefit from using the Roundup Ready crops, the yield differences and such disappear.
No, I would dispute that because I'd just say, you know, if the farmer's not getting a benefit, they sure aren't going to pay the premium that Monsanto is charging them.
Well,
so if the farmer's looking at it and after a couple of years saying, it doesn't really make any difference to me, they're going to go back to the cheaper thing, because one thing farmers are very, very acutely aware of is costs. And I'm sure dairy farmers are the same way as corn farmers. You know, it's cost. They've got a lot of risk.
Farmers at the coffee shop, and a lot of farmers do stupid things that don't give them economic benefit. And then there's also some good studies that are peer-reviewed that show that there's problems with the GMO corn and soy as far as feeding it to at least lab animals. And then our history of, you know, in the last 15 years since these crops have been on the market, of increased allergies, ADHD, diabetes, obesity, and autism in our kids doesn't speak well for it in our food supply.
Sure, and you know, that one point, that last point, I would say, please separate cause and effect from correlation, because correlation does not prove cause and effect. Just because we've had an increase in diagnoses of certain things like autism.
It doesn't negate it.
No, it doesn't. I give you that. I absolutely give you that.
Scientific inquiry should come from correlation.
If I could make-
Absolutely.
If I could make a
epidemiological study.
One of the things we learned in a previous seminar on GMO foods is that there is almost no good data on the effects of GMO foods. Almost all of the studies are severely underpowered and prove absolutely nothing. And so when people start citing studies, a good study said this and a good study said that, probably not. There are very few good studies.
That's because almost all of them are done by the companies.
Well, there's truth in that, that's correct.
There are good studies out there, but they're dismissed by the highly paid advocates for the biotech industry.
That probably occurs to some effect, but the main problem is just the severe underpowering of almost all of the studies.
Except this past April, there was very definitive research published by two researchers from MIT, and that would be Stephanie Seneff, and I cannot remember the name of her colleague. His last name also begins with an S. And what they were studying is the shikimate, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, protein pathway, which is found in insects.
What was the protocol of the study? What did they do?
They were studying the shikimate pathway.
Right. What was the protocol? What did they do in the study? How did they conduct the study? What were they given to, what was given to how
So
many
I'd like
subjects?
to finish what I was saying.
Okay.
Which is that what they found is that that pathway, which isn't found in insects, and therefore the Roundup does affect the insects, it is not found in humans and mammals. However, the new piece of information that they are offering is that that pathway is found in microorganisms. Microorganisms are essential to the functioning of the human immune system, not to mention the health of the soil. So if Roundup destroys the shikimate pathway in microorganisms, gee, might there be a relationship to what's happening to human health?
Was that related to the bee issue as far as the number of bees in the
That's more
By microorganisms, you mean the microbiota? That's all the
Microbiota.
good bacteria that's helping us digest.
Also fungi.
This is good. Riled up. Okay, my second example is the Human Genome Diversity Project and the Maori. I was in New Zealand, and a good friend of mine is a native Maori Islander, and I was in New Zealand in March, and so it was nice to be immersed in a culture for a little while and be reacquainted with their perspective and beliefs. But so this is why, and that's one of the reasons why I use this particular example. The Human Genome Project was the mapping of the human genome. It cost what, $13 billion or something. You guys, wow, good guys.
Got nothing for you.
It wasn't cheap.
It wasn't cheap. It was very expensive. And almost immediately, what it does is it map the entire genome of human beings. That's all the loci of all these DNA that express the different traits and so on. And almost immediately, this was a boom for biotech scientists and corporations. They found this rich wealth of information to create more research technologies and more pharmaceuticals. So so there was an idea of in the scientific community to map the genomes of threatened indigenous populations, because there is a biological variation in human populations with ancestries in different places. Of course there is. It's everything from our skin tone. People from ancestry of Northern Europe have lighter skin so they can get more UV light, so they can get more vitamin A and the other one, and that helps the processes of creating calcium in their bones and so on. It's limitless. We all have our different biological adaptations of our ancestors inside of us. So they wanted to sample 722 endangered indigenous populations and get and just probably like a swab out of their teeth or whatever, to get their DNA to see if they could find anything in their DNA that could help that population and other populations to have a more resistance to modern diseases, especially the chronic behavior-associated diseases such as type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Some of these populations don't seem to be as prone to those diseases. Why not? They're eating the same crappy diet. So maybe there's a genetic component there. So the claim was this is a value-free scientific altruistic project. And I think a lot of scientists absolutely believe that. It was also a boom for anthropologists. Anthropologists are usually underfunded endeavors. We see it in anthropologists, they're probably, a lot of them are wearing secondhand clothes. Right up there with bots. I know, because I am an anthropologist. So they had this $25 million of grants out there by the NSF to go out into these indigenous populations and just get a cheek swab. I'm like, I would totally sign up. I'd be like, oh my God, they'd take my hair fair, I could talk to cool people, let's do it. Okay, so who's benefiting here? Are the Maori or the other indigenous people benefiting? Or is it just the scientific community at the Maori and other indigenous communities' expense? Really? So some indigenous rights people believe, well, one, it's all you are is taking more stuff away from the indigenous people. You took our land, you took our religion, you took our culture, and now you want to take our DNA, really? You know, get off my reservation. That was one perspective. The other perspective is, hey, we were here, this helps humanity. And this will, you know, maybe we can, we looked at the DNA of Pima Indians in New Mexico, and we found markers showing that they do have issues with a lot of modern foods. They're more prone to getting type 2 diabetes and alcoholism more so than European heritage people. Because there's some biological factors, and of course there's a lot of cultural factors, poverty. You know, if you're poor, don't have a lot of money, and all you can afford is fast food or high starchy grains, you know, you're gonna have health issues. So there's correlations there, and it's very easy to make them into causations, but it's very important to test them too. Because you don't want to blame people in poverty, saying it's their fault that they have diabetes and some of the genes. You see what I'm saying? A lot of their material cultural factors are forcing them to eat unhealthy foods. How do you get it? So one of the cross-cultural issues, my favorite, was when the researchers went to this Maori population, they were trying to explain to some of the elders who don't speak English that they wanted to get a gene sample. And so the Maori name for gene is Intangata, which means we would like your life spirit of a mortal. I'm so glad that wasn't me, actually. Obviously, I mean, my Maori friend, he's 6'3", he's a big guy, used to play on a feeder team for the All Blacks, the rugby. I just would hate to piss those guys off, especially their grandma and grandpa. And then the other word, they're trying to explain to anthropologists in this little anecdote I read, they said, well, no, we use a different word. It's your genealogy. It's so wakapapa. Oh, we want a sample of your ancestral heritage for our commercial use to make medicine. And they were thrown off and they were unsuccessful. It's a cultural issue.
Yeah, we'll also realize that the word gene was only maybe 100 years old or so in the English language.
That's true.
So, you know, 200 years ago in America or Britain or any English-speaking country, you say, well, you know, we want your genes. You'd have to go through the same sort of translation, which may have been just as awkward or silly.
Or soul.
Yeah, we like to say
we want your soul.
To make products. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I think it's only after the rediscovery of Mendel's laws that came into effect and started being used, what, like 60, 80 years ago?
I actually question the association. The word for gene is such and such. How old is that Maori word? I'll bet it's a lot older than gene. I suspect it's not really the word for gene. It's the word that somebody has more recently substituted.
You're absolutely right.
And the test would be take a mouth swab from somebody in that culture and ask them, is this your iriga nata, or whatever it is? Is it in here? Is this on the end of this tip? I doubt they would agree with that.
Well, I would never do that because it's kind of insulting.
Yeah. Take your own out.
Greg, they're bigger than you, okay?
Got that. But so you take your own and you ask them the same. My my suspicion is it's not an exact translation.
No, it's
And
not.
so, yeah, if you ask me, can I take your life spirit away? Well, I'd rather you not.
Well, that's part of the problem that we face with this, with different groups, even within our own cultures, is asking them these kinds of questions because there isn't a parallel in their own existence.
I understand.
So that's one of the issues that we're looking at in this kind of
And I think
seminar.
it's even a larger problem than that, because it seems to trace from this Western idea of making a deal, right? Dealing with the top guy. So if we think of it as it's epitomized in our corporate culture. So if Microsoft a while ago wanted to make a deal with Facebook, right? Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg would hole up in a hotel room with some wine or some coffee or something, and they'd hash it out and make a deal. And that's how we do things, right? The top guy or the president of the country meets another president and hashes it out and makes a treaty or a deal. So we have this sort of patriarchal idea of how things are done. And there are these cultures, as you're pointing out, that don't have a top guy, or the top guy is responsible for everybody to make group decisions. And so I just question the idea of whether somebody has to pay for something to be taken in the first place. The whole concept of the money, who you're going to give it to, is just non-functional. And it's not just in this realm that we see bad things happening. To me, the real bad thing that was done to some of these people is to go in there and give them the expectation that they're going to get something of great value if a researcher comes in and takes some plant samples or something. That's where the damage was really done. And we see it in a lot of places where there's oil, right? So the Western oil companies or even European oil companies come in and they make a deal with the top guy, and he gets all the oil revenue, and he's supposed to distribute it. How many times has that happened, right? So almost always in these oil-rich countries, the top guy that they picked becomes the military dictator and slaughters everybody else. And I think it's just an inappropriate application of this patriarchal concept of dealing with the top guy.
Well, absolutely. It's ignoring the fact that every complex society is hierarchical and insected in sections, segmented out. And if you're dealing with the top people, that's all you're dealing with. And they don't talk to the people, the indigenous people, or the other marginalized communities.
Sure. And
So
if you ask them, are you in charge? What are they going to say? Yes, I'm in charge.
Yeah, I'm in charge. Yeah, of course. In a lot of these places that I've been to, I mean, I honestly felt like a walking wallet. Here she comes.
Yeah.
What are we gonna get?
Yeah.
Because cash is so scarce in some of these places, especially places under economic transition that have gone from a reciprocal subsistence economy, like I'm thinking of rural Bihar in India, where these villages were self-contained units, and then all of a sudden you have the industrialization of India in the last 50 years, and you have all of a sudden this need for cash, or the kids can't get to school because they have to pay to go to school. That's another story, even though schools are free. So, yeah.
I think one of the biggest things that I've learned from people that have been successful in protecting cultural heritage and cultural property, they tend to understand there is no one person in charge. It's a council. You meet with the council. You find the leaders that are the leaders of their groups and send the ripples in a way that has no one person. And that's a key component, I think, that, and I'm sure you've experienced that too, in many cultures, is not just one person. You've got to gain the trust of the whole tribe, of the whole council, before you can make any kind of movement. And you have to have that reciprocity, especially with the seed saving. They have so much to gain if you can work with them and protect their heritage in a way that's like no other. When we're talking about we're doing our scientific studies and gathering our data so we can preserve you or help you or
it's
learn from
building
you.
of rapport and trust.
Yeah.
And there has to be transparency for that. There has to be a same mind. We're all the same page here.
Yeah.
So when you're in areas like very corrupt developing countries, there's no transparency. There's no rapport. There's no exchange. So what are we thinking we're going to come in and somehow make it all work? It doesn't work where it is. It's the same people in the same country. They're segmented away. So that was a good one. Okay, the last one is, I read this in this article that was published this month called Linux for Lettuce, and I come from a tech background as over 10 years as a web developer, and I thought, oh my God, we can do open source seeds, why not? Let's do it. And then I read more about it, and I'm like, oh, well, you certainly can, but there are some factors there. Unfortunately, I don't mean to pick on Monsanto because there's Syngenta. There's all kinds of sorry, Steve. So Okay, so just I'm going to run this story. So there's this genesis and plant breeder in Oregon State named Jim Myers, and he thought, hey, you know, this is a really cool project. I'm going to breed this exserted head of broccoli. So it's a broccoli plant with a very long stem, so you can harvest it very easily. You don't have to pull down the leaves and so on. So he picked up the plantings and cultivated broccoli heads that he was breeding from his successor, Jim Baggett. Jim got it from these people in Massachusetts that were breeding since the 50s. And then they thought, okay, we need some more genetic diversity. I'm not a plant breeder, so tell me if I don't know what I'm talking about, guys. But apparently it works much better, and you get the strains that you want much more quickly the more breeders you have to work with, the more genetic diversity you have to work with, right? So they got breeders all over the United States trying to figure out how to grow this broccoli, these long-stemmed broccolis. Well, one of those seed breeders was purchased by Seminis, which was the largest vegetable seed company in the world.
And they're local.
And they're local.
Yeah, Oxford.
Are they?
Or was, I don't know, there used to be.
Yeah, they're in Oxford.
Is it still?
Yeah, they're down on Rose Avenue.
Yeah, I know. I remember driving by there on the Sun Rose on the way to PCH. And they were purchased by Monsanto.
All right, yeah.
In 2005. So then you have Monsanto owns them as well. So Monsanto, I think, is responsible for 20% of the seed patents in the United States.
I think it was more like 40% of all the seed lines. And if you look at all the long list of all the Seminis varieties, a lot of us in the organic trade were kind of horrified, even though by permission, some of the varieties, for example, Bronco green bean, which is owned by Seminis, is now grown organically, and then the organic seed is then used by organic farmers, which is the requirement. But it's actually a Seminis product. Some of the seed vendors, the politically motivated ones like Fedco in Massachusetts, or rather in Maine, have decided they will not sell any more Seminis varieties as a protest to what was going on. They are standing in the wings to release all these things, and they release various vegetables or products whenever the time is right, and they think that perhaps the public will accept them. But all of the vegetable varieties that Monsanto purchased when they obtained Seminis have been modified to be resistant to herbicides, but they have not, and they've been tested, but they've not been released.
They're not released commercially.
No.
Because we only have, 8 GMO commercially released crops.
Yeah, there's, in terms of direct food crops that humans eat, there's a corn, there's a yellow squash, there's sugar beets, and then there's all then there's canola oil and cottonseed oil that ends up being consumed by humans.
Steve, I have a question.
Yeah.
Steve, the Bronco bean that's owned by Seminis, so therefore owned by Monsanto, has been modified to be Roundup ready. It's not been GMO genetically modified to be Roundup ready, is it? Because my understanding is that it has not.
Oh, they're not. Well, they have modified. I don't know if Bronco specifically has, but I know that there have been reports from some field trials in Salinas of a wide variety of vegetables that have been modified to see if they will be useful and effective.
But not genetically
modified to be Roundup Ready resistant.
But again, let's be clear, none of those are in commercial.
No, they're not out. No, they're not out.
And they may have been produced in the lab, and maybe
and they did some field trials.
Yeah, but none of them are in production today.
No.
And I wouldn't go as far as saying the entire Seminis portfolio, because that is a big portfolio, as you know. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of different varieties and species.
And they chose the ones, of course, that would be useful, like spinach, carrots, things that are a big pain in the neck to weed, or who have now some kind of herbicide tolerance for the target herbicides that they've been using on.
But none of them have been released commercially. No. Only 3 vegetables I know released commercially. It's Brussels sprouts, papaya, squash, and sugar beets, right? and others are grains, and they've caught. That's it. There's only 3. I just found this out, about a year ago. I started my seminar, so thinking, wow, I'm in Vaughn's and like, God, everything's GMO now. What do I buy? I guess I better buy. Before I knew anything, and I'm like, there's only 3. You'll never see. There's no GMO tomatoes out there. There's no GMO strawberries out there commercially. And that was news to me. So, anybody, somebody has a question?
One other point is that, for example, this bean that was developed by Seminus years ago, and it's not. It may have been bred by them and sold by them many years ago, but it wasn't protected in any way that still gives them the sole ownership rights to it. If there was some sort of plant variety patent on it, it's expired long ago. So anybody has the right to produce that. A farmer can make his own seed. Even another seed company can make seed from that.
That's an important point.
Another kind of interesting angle is friends with Paul Albright, and he was kind of noting that some of the test trials of some of the GMO crops were like what he would consider to be production level, growing out. So they may be just doing some little field trials, but their field trials may be enough to supply quite a few growers with veggies.
With regard to the vegetable varieties, I think one of the things that's concerning to us in the lay organic seed production sector, which a lot of us are not trained, but I still grow lots of seeds, both to sell as well as to use, is that as we followed the advent, ever since the advent of modification, we've noticed that there's been an appalling lack of agronomical horse sense utilized in sequestering this genetics. And so then they're finding an awful lot of inadvertent contamination from conventional farmers who don't want it, from people who are trying to export regular crops that are ended up with markers at a point of entry in Holland or in Tokyo. And the organic farmers who are being tested for genetic modification have had to grow their things with these insane protocols of harvesting out broad swaths of their field on the exterior and holding the grain in various bins till they finally get to the heart of their field, and then testing that to see if that will make the grain. And so then when this was realized, this is a long time ago actually, when this was realized, and the USDA started trying to impose some protocols so that they wouldn't have a lot of this contamination. One of the reasons that it's a problem is that if you end up with a patented variety, then you may end up being sued. Maybe more is made of the Percy Schmeiser case in Canada of this guy who ended up with some GMO canola in his field. But there are quite a few examples of people who have saved seed or inadvertently had some of this Monsanto patented seed, and it's essentially theft. So for the lay people in the seed saving sector, for example, people like me, we're concerned that how broad a contamination issue is out there with regard to growing some of these things, and there are only specific areas in the world where you have the combination of all the right agronomical aspects of weather and temperature and rain and humidity to make a good seed crop. It's hell to grow seed in Texas, I can tell you because I tried it. There's a reason why they grow a lot of seed quite successfully in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. And why they grow it with a lot of success in Idaho. And then, of course, that's where they grow all of the modified sugar beet seed, and now it's blown up because now all of the members of that family of beets and chard that are grown in the Willamette Valley are ending up with modification, in other words, with markers, not pure resistance to glyphosate, but with a problem that ends up being a contamination issue, especially when the organic farmers are supposed to use organic seeds, and then now we're trying to make a decision, is it an organic seed if it's got modification? If it has these foreign invasive genetics in it, what is our tolerance level? Will we allow 5%, 10%? The Europeans don't allow, what do they allow? 1% or
It's low.
It's very low.
0.9% is kind of like the accepted standard among food commodity buyers in Europe.
Yeah, and so a lot of us are asking for that same kind of percentage of contamination because someone's got to hold that line way out here on the left. Because if you don't, then you'll just be dragged to 25%, and then you'll have nothing. And so certain seed producers like me are identifying growing areas like mine where I don't have anybody around me at all. However, somebody who could be growing modified corn a couple hundred feet away from me, I wouldn't know it. But anyway, chances are not. And so these are the kinds of legal things that we're trying to grapple with now with regard to defining organic, with regard to maintaining a pure gene pool of all these seeds. It was an interesting coincidence that 40 years ago when the Seed Savers movement started, the Seed Savers Exchange started back in Iowa, that was right when people began to be interested in saving seeds, and then by the time modification ramped up, there was a population, thousands of people who had no training whatsoever, who now knew the difference between a hybridized seed and why you can't save a hybrid, because you don't have two parents in the field, and why you can't save pumpkin if you're growing butternut squash right next to it.
Okay.
No, because you don't know what those two parents may cross, and you'll end up with something inadvertent. And so a lot of us learned by virtue of trial and error, as well as because we were vitally interested with it, and I had no idea. Somebody asked me, why were you interested? I don't really know why I was. Why did I start saving seeds? And it has the same kind of basis as a religion or something, which is inexplicable.
Can I ask you, in the current definition of organic foods, organic seeds, does that encompass whether it's GMO or not? Would you say that an organic product can't be GMO?
Yes, actually, that is in the final rules when they were promulgated in 2001.
So it sounds like what's happening here is that two things are being conflated, and that's contributing to the problem. So on the one hand, you've got pesticide-free, which is how I think of organic. Organic is food that's grown without pesticides or unnatural chemicals or materials. And the concept of GMO, which in the definition sounds like it's mixed together, it's conflated, but really maybe they ought to be pulled apart so that you can have organic versus non-organic, or GMO or non-GMO, and the two are really kind of separate things. I don't know if that would be helpful or make more confusing.
We have it. Actually, that's how things have now evolved. And so now recently, back in March, the Natural Organic Foods Conference, the national conference in Anaheim, the convention center, with 3 floors of people and 25,000 people in attendance. I was appalled at how many people who were not organic had a GMO-free certification now. And the organic trade and the organic movement has completely dropped the ball, because we are de facto, by law, genetically modified free. And actually, we did the testing beforehand and have these protocols. But now people, in order to obtain the goodwill of the consumer, are now not organic, but GMO-free.
Yeah.
So now this GMO-free thing is like taking off like a wildfire.
Yep.
And we had no idea. We didn't see that coming.
And although it may be more accurate to separate the distinction into multiple labels, from a consumer standpoint, they don't want to have to read all those labels. They want to be able to see one thing. Like they'll be satisfied when they're like, oh, it's organic, okay. Oh, it's GMO-free, okay. And then they feel okay about the purchase because their intent is there, but the knowledge is not necessarily there of all of them.
Knowledge is not there. I know one thing I read about the genetically modified papaya crop, and Hawaii, they almost lost their entire papaya crop to fungus. So a researcher,
Bacterial leaf spot.
thank you, just correct me, just fill in my gaps in my sentence, I'll blank, yes. And I really appreciate your help, because I'm just definitely a layperson with this stuff. But I thought, in my mind as a consumer, I don't want more pesticides in our water supply. I don't want more herbicides. I don't want things that sicken people that make it unsustainable agriculture. I want soil engineering. I want the soil to be, with doing mixing crops so you can replenish the nitrogen and so on naturally. So you have these genetically modified papayas. Can you grow them organically?
Well, you could grow them organically. In other words, that's a practice. Organic is a practice.
Right.
So in other words, you do not use any synthetic, non-naturally occurring substances in order to produce the crop. But if the seed itself was a modified seed that produces a papaya that's immune to this leaf ring spot virus, then it's not organic by definition, because none of the seeds that you use can be organic.
That's kind of what I'm at.
I mean, it can be modified, sorry.
Separate organic as a practice from GMO as a state, essentially.
That's exactly what we do.
Yeah, okay. And so that might mean reviewing the definition of organic and getting rid of the non-GMO part of it, so that it could be possible to have organic produce, which is GMO, but then
I think that's
then
you have to have GMO labeling. That would be probably the last thing we would ever do, is because it's so antithetical. Because it's a non-naturally occurring substance. It's an invasive, and it's a synthetic process, and so that's the baseline.
Yeah.
It's in synthetic versus synthetic, man-made versus naturally occurring.
So you're distinguishing between something that you know technically, but then there's what the public understands. So I think the public understanding of organic is probably closer to what I described. It's a practice of how you grow things. And you may be technically
I would disagree with that.
Okay.
Well, and for me, I've been enamored by the business side of farming, because I'm not a farmer, but I'd like to be. I'd like to have land, and then I look at what they do, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I could do that, because all the bureaucracy they have to deal with. And like, if you are an organic farmer, Steve, do you have to? My understanding is you have to do all your due diligence to try to source organic seed. But if you're large scale, sometimes you can't source organic seed for your size.
Yeah.
And then you have to just do your due diligence, showing that you tried, and then you can go ahead and buy non-organic seed for your organic production, and still, in the end, stamp it organic because you raised it and farmed it that way. So
that's true, and even though that has been true, and we were very reluctant to agree to that kind of exemption.
Yeah.
Even though that's happened, as Mike can say, the seed business leaped to the challenge, and they're the biggest seed people in the world now have an organic division, and they are trying to produce enough organic seed to satisfy this exponentially growing sector. So we've gone from people like me who are farming on a postage stamp to literally the largest vegetable producers in the world have a stake in this now. William Bolthouse, which is the world's largest carrot grower, has probably 10 or 12,000 acres of organic carrots now. And Mike, isn't that a lot of organic carrot seed?
But how sustainable is that practice? That's the thing I keep seeing, is like,
I've inspected them. It's insane what these guys are
the
doing.
inputs
They're using some of their organic practices on their conventional fields.
That's the thing. I've seen some of the inputs and just discussions on the sustainability and long-term management practice. And
Well, I don't know if we want to get the sustainability either, because actually it's a word that's used quite prominently in Monsanto's website.
Well, yes.
So it's in the eye of the beholder, it's like, okay, sustainability.
Just like natural though, right?
Yeah.
The word natural is the eye of the beholder.
Natural actually is only defined according to the Food and Drug Administration's definition of what you can put into a meat product after it has been packaged. That's the only legal definition of natural. But you can use it on post toasties or whatever.
Just like they say tastes good.
Tastes good, natural. Yeah, and actually there's no even any consumer protections with regard to assuring that the claim would be
true.
Okay, I want to make a quick plug for the legal industry. We get a lot of bad press, lawyers do, but tort lawyers, who are some of the most vilified of all lawyers, have actually been very excited and active in pursuing. In the last couple of years, we maybe have 24 class actions saying, how dare you confuse and defraud customers, consumers, by putting all natural on your labels when A, you're using all kinds of odd forms of sugar, or B, you've got GMO products in your all natural protein drink, Naked Juice, owned by PepsiCo. And what's happening is these companies like PepsiCo and even mom and pop companies like Barbara's, you know, these Barbara's Naturals, they are saying, ouch, we do not want to go before a jury and explain why we were using GMO. We do not want to go before a jury and explain why we're calling natural when we're using all kinds of additives or whatever. So what we're going to do is just write a check, and how many zeros would you like? End of commercial.
Should I also add something to that? Let's also not consider the word natural with necessarily tasting good, because there's a lot of confusion about that. You know, people nowadays are eating heirloom tomatoes because they think they taste better than newer, modified or improved genetically, not genetically modified tomatoes, but improved tomatoes through other kinds of breeding. But that's not necessarily true, because if you were to ask me, and probably all of you who remember eating sweet corn in, say, the 60s or 70s, before super sweet corn bred by human beings, not God, is way better than the old corn. I don't think you can argue about that. Would anybody here buy any watermelon that had seeds in it, for God's sake?
No. Yeah. Got more flavor.
The seedless ones, I think, have way more flavor, plus you don't have to mess with all the seeds in it. Okay, well, those weren't made by God either. Those are not natural. So, but they taste better, in my opinion. I think that nowadays you would find a large amount of agreement that the improved varieties that are out there made by breeders in the laboratory taste and are much better. And so if you can have a papaya that grows in Hawaii that otherwise wouldn't grow, and you don't have to spray it, but it is genetically modified, what's wrong with that fundamentally? It's not bad for you.
So one thing I wonder about a lot, about food being created in the lab and tasting better is that I know statistically the quality of our food, the nutrients in our food have been going down and down and down for decades. And one thing that tastes good is nutrients. So yeah, maybe they make it in a lab and maybe there's more sugar content in it. I mean, I'm just throwing out the question here.
Well, it could be that the nutrients are down for reasons of intensive farming on the same ground.
Or also just because so many things are processed nowadays.
Yeah.
I think it's the processing that's the biggest
No, as far as the individual varieties of fruits and vegetables.
Well, we've been breeding, baby food breeding. We want things that are not as bitter, we want things that are softer, and like more palatable, yeah. Yes, so that's baby food breeding that we do on a mass scale.
Oh, and
So
let's
it's like
not forget.
iceberg lettuce versus yuppie greens, you know, the bitter, strongly flavored greens, you know. The iceberg lettuce has, you know, close to the zilch, you know, phytonutrients, but then, you know, these rich green, you know, mustards and arugula and all these other things that you get in these yuppie green salads that, you know, you got a lot more phytonutrients in the
Well, it's one of the reasons
green
that really good
one.
organic produce like Steve tastes better than what you pick up commercially grown.
I think part of the cause of the loss of nutrients is for sure what Greg said, processing. But even in the food pre-processed, you know, if you ask any breeder probably just about on any crop what their top 3 priorities are, they're going to say yield, yield, and yield. They want to produce more on the same amount of land with fewer inputs, less nitrogen, less whatever. And as a result, that's what's been selected for over the past decades, that any one crop has been bred by natural crossing of varieties to increase yield, and yield. And nobody's doing much analysis or putting as much emphasis on the phytonutrient profile, the vitamin profile, the whatever. That's sort of an afterthought in a lot of breeders' programs today, and certainly in the past. So I think that's part of the cause, and I think the processing is a huge
So when
one
you
as
say
well.
processing, you're not talking about straight produce, you're talking about
Like canned
stuff that
foods,
comes in a box.
Canned
Okay,
foods
so I'm
and
just
processed
referring to
foods.
statistics that I've read having to do with straight produce.
Yeah, but I think I would modify what you said a little bit in that the breeders are going for ROI, for return on investment, that they want something that will sell. And so what segment of the marketplace are they selling to? Well, they plan on selling their veggies to. So a lot of times, it's yield plus a combination of flavor, market handling, and shelf life, and other things like that.
In vegetables, you're probably right.
Yeah.
In something like corn that's grown on hundreds of millions of acres, or soybean, or staples, any of these staples that are basically, we just want calories or protein to feed, to nourish people. We're not so concerned about the nutritional content. I think it's still yield, and yield.
I get all the magazines, and none of the seeds are promoted to me according to any of that. It's always disease resistant, more yield, quicker to market,
Easier to harvest.
all these other attributes that are bottom line oriented, not
Economic.
like someone like me who sells directly to people. I will make
That's
the other
because I think a
decisions
lot of the
about
nutrients
like
come from
nutrients.
the combination of the soil health
Yeah.
and the microorganisms, both of which are going down here.
I worked at the Waltham Experiment Station, which took the hookneck squash and made it square, the original Waltham walnut squash. And as an employee there, they go around and give us samples where it was already cooked and said, which one tastes better?
They did.
Yeah, they did. We always did taste tests for improving the Waltham squashes. Even though they were made square so you could ship them.
Right.
You never see a long gooseneck squash. They break and ship them.
So then you make your decision based on that. But then did the information, was it used in some kind of marketing thereafter?
It was used to select the seeds for next year's breeding.
Right, but it was it sold to me as like great flavor?
Yeah, eventually.
I don't see that great flavor business in the seed catalogs or the magazines.
It's not marketed as such
Yeah,
to farmers.
but you want to make sure you have something preferable so that the grower will go back to your product year after year.
Well, let me ask you a question. Isn't there a consumer rejection of something, even if it's, you can get a lot of it for cheap, at some point consumers might say, that's the worst one on the market. You certainly don't want to be the worst tasting seed.
I think Steve's point was right. If you're talking about fresh vegetables, directly tasting it. But for commodity crops, corn and soybeans and things like that, or oils, it may not matter that much. Presumably the really bad tasting ones were already selected against in the development process, so they never make it to market.
Feed them to cows.
I feel like there's an elephant in the room here.
In the yellow shirt.
Oh, I wanted to share, there's a book called Eating on the Wild Side. I don't know if any of you read it. Joe Robinson came out about a year ago, all about how the last 10,000 years plant breeding has been breeding out the nutrition, and the wilder the vegetable, like the garlic still has its nutrition because it hasn't been highly bred. But the tomatoes came from South America, small, very nutritious. Now they're beefsteak and they're not nearly as nutritious. The higher color, more nutrition with some exceptions, like cauliflower has nutrition. And it seems to be thoroughly researched. There's a long bibliography. I recommend it.
Yeah, I'll talk to you later. I love books.
I bet that's not a modern thing, sort of like breeding for yield. I bet that happened from when people started first studying.
Oh, sure, yeah.
They weren't thinking about nutrition back then. They were just thinking how to get more
food,
more food. So it's nothing new.
I feel like there's an elephant in the room here. That there's a topic that was briefly mentioned that hasn't been talked about at all, which is human DNA. Now we have Human Genome Project, we have DNA kits being sold. Monsanto was going along and accidentally discovered something that was disease resistant. So a pharmaceutical company is going along and discovers that a human being or a group of human beings have immunity to X, Y, Z disease. And they have easy access these days to people's DNA. Who's protecting our individual DNA? Should we all be patenting our own DNA, our own genes, our own?
That is very
I think I can answer this one actually. It's not our individual DNA that matters. No, there's no indigenous people's DNA that's any better or any different than anybody else's. But within different isolated populations in the world, there is sufficient inbreeding so that every once in a while you get basically what would in some cases be a unique disease state to that population. In some cases it's a unique resistance they have. So, there's a new product that Amgen has in trials now. They've already announced these results. It's doing well. But it was actually discovered because there was a woman who was genetically modified to have extremely low cholesterol. And that one woman will do a huge benefit to the planet for having participated in helping people understand the properties required in the receptors and the interactions of all the biochemicals on our cell surfaces to allow people who have lipitor resistance and statin resistance or hypocholesterolemia who are going to die at 35, those people may all move forward into much longer, healthier lives now.
How low?
By the benefit of that one individual.
How low are they? How are they? So do you know what her levels are normally? Because the human body needs cholesterol. Our brain is 70% cholesterol by dry weight. We need cholesterol to make sex hormones. How low is her cholesterol?
Okay, and so I can't answer that. I don't know.
I'd like to
Okay,
answer.
there are lots of scientists who could answer that for you. I personally don't know.
I'd like
But
to.
I was going to the point about the origin of why these genetics are important. And what happens is the patent will expire. Everybody, all humanity for all times will now understand that piece of science and benefit from it. Especially people who have genetic high cholesterol.
Long after the patent is expired.
I'd like to go back to the question that you raised about who's protecting our DNA and our cultural heritage. And I believe it is responsive to your question that just I think it was June of last year, so just over a year ago, the United States Supreme Court took on that question. They don't take on every question, but they said, we want to answer that question. And it was more the question of, is human DNA patentable? And I think really the question was more, is DNA patentable? And the way they answered it the ripples are still coming out and understanding what they meant, because in some cases these decisions are oracular, so you have to kind of interpret what they're saying. But basically they said, if all you did was isolate someone's DNA without more, you can't claim that as something you can fence off and claim as your own. So you have to show that you did something besides just discovering it, like a planet or like a mineral. So this is a question before the courts now. All the lower courts are dealing with that question. So the patent lawyers are just, you wouldn't believe the chaos right now in trying to understand, well, how much do we have to do to make it something, innovative that we can take profits from, that we can claim as our property. So this question it may be an elephant in the room in this, because we've talked about so many things, but this is not a secret or something that people aren't talking about quite a bit in the courts and in these laboratories.
I formerly was in the board of directors of Cornucopia, and we were one of the plaintiffs in a patent lawsuit. We kind of got tired of trying to get anything done through regular channels. So we joined with a number of different organizations and went to the patent courts. trying to plead a case there. And our case was heard by a patent attorney in New York who threw it out and quoted almost entirely the defendant's rationale in throwing it out. Well, it went immediately to the defendant's home jurisdiction, which is in St. Louis, where Monsanto is. And it was Monsanto who were suing in this patent case. And so this kind of throws up, this information is so exquisitely exotic. You're really asking even learned people in judges to grapple with this stuff, and I think it's really asking an awful lot.
Well, one of the things I'm wondering is there's a whole generation of women after the sexual revolution who had abortions. Okay? Now, what happened to those fetuses? Were they destroyed? We have this whole issue of stem cells now. I mean, were those fetuses destroyed, or did some company come in and say, hey, we'd like to do some experiments on them? And they've discovered that there are some stem cells out there that are really valuable. Now, the woman who had the abortion is not benefiting by it, but whose property is that? Those women went in and had abortions thinking that that's it. But unbeknownst to them on the side, there's a major pharmaceutical company or some kind of biotech company or something developing who knows what from that. Whose intellectual property is that?
So the implication is that there's harm done to those patients. I'm struggling to see the harm. What's the harm that was done to them?
Well, perhaps, I don't know, there's a lot of different ways.
So I can answer on the good side, maybe those particular women wouldn't benefit. They might actually, if they live in the home, but their kids might benefit. And their children's children almost certainly will benefit if there's anything good discovered from those stem cells. And I don't see the harm. So.
Well, the harm might be is if the pharmaceutical company traces it back to an individual and decides that they don't want anybody else developing it while they're developing it. So they're going to do everything they can to, I don't know, isolate this individual or turn them in, to protect what they view as their intellectual property.
I think that we're all conscious in the license area because we all the taxpayers and support the NIH. So I would say the NIH and the National Cancer Foundation are the main organizations behind almost all of that research.
As far as collecting cells, it's not that some of this is traditionally anything that was taken from the body, whether it was cancer cell, fetus, skin, whatever, belonged to the doctor at the medical institution, and they really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what they're doing. Now that's changed recently with a case of cancer cells called and that whole process is because they finally identified a woman from Blairity cancer cells. And they're still alive. They're still in labs today. In fact, show you 10 minutes. One was left. Now the shift has changed. It's shifted because of this woman and they found out who she was. There's been more movement toward I still own the cells that came out of me.
Yeah.
But I don't think the
Suppose
profession is really following that yet.
But suppose that woman were still alive.
Her
And that
family-
company,
family's still alive.
Right.
To recover the cells.
But she had consented. She had signed a consent form.
But she didn't know.
Well, it was
But that's-
1951.
Yeah.
We'll do a whole seminar on that case, because I love that.
And they can trick people with
I came in ready to present other kinds of stuff.
signed
And I
over
changed my
days.
mind, right?
Yeah.
In fact, this was 60 years ago.
And suppose she was still alive.
I know.
They wanted to
It's
affect
the
Okay,
audience.
you guys, everybody,
them to have her dead.
everybody, I'm gonna, I'm gonna ask you guys, here's the deal. This happened with Laura's last time, is that we have so many ideas and people come with so many interesting perspectives that Angela, I know she's happy and excited to hear from everybody, and then it ends up people say, wow, that went on too long. You know? So how do you balance that? Because the issue here is we need a seminar on the Henrietta Lacks and the Immortal, the Light. That's a fabulous book. We need a whole seminar on that. Angela, let's give everybody scope so they know, is this going to go on until tomorrow, like some Indigenous council, which is amazing. You know, I mean, so I know you have like a whole nother seminar.
We have a whole other seminar, everybody. And my purpose here was to have, extra slides, extra topics. I printed out, 15 pages of pros and cons of everything from GMO to this and that. I was a little nervous that we would run out of things to say, but I see that I have. But I don't want to keep you guys here till 4 o'clock anyway. So I'm gonna wrap it up. It's about just shy of 9:40, and I wanted maybe 5 more minutes of a few more questions to our distinguished panelists, and then we'll finish at 9:45. I think we're good to go because we do have to get to work.
And I'm going to pass around a sheet and what you guys say, what seminars you'd like to cover in the next cycle of the next year, because this is the end of a cycle of a year's worth of seminars. So everybody write down what seminar you'd like to attend in the future.
I also did, while you're thinking about that, I did quite a bit of research. And if any of you would like me to send my bibliography and online sources, if you're interested in organic seeds, seed libraries, pro and con research on several sides of the debate. As you see, this is not. And some really fun books to read, because you can't fall asleep that night. I'm just a geek. I can read anything if I don't say anything exciting. But yeah, please leave your email, and maybe we'll check mark by it, and I'll just email you my bibliography too. But much of this research I did several years ago in grad school has to do with culture, so it's not just biotech, but it's also a lot of cultural issues with indigenous practice.
I would like a copy. Just send it to me.
Yeah, Camarillo Seed Library.
Yeah, Camarillo Seed.
Okay, yeah, I have that on here in a lot of the seed saving places.
I love a copy.
Thank you. Yeah, I have your email anyway. So.
Yes.
Okay, a few more questions. Yeah, Laura.
So I have kind of a consumer question, and and maybe this would be a whole nother topic, I don't know, but I'm going to throw it out to the people in the room because I think you guys will have an answer. So through natural selection and hybrid vigor and the whole evolution process, the survival of the fittest, has kind of been how things have evolved, and it happens naturally. And some 100 years ago or whatever, scientists started improving and increasing that process through natural selection, through the natural breeding process of improving plants and animals in a laboratory setting. And so again, we're increasing hybrid vigor, making plants more disease resistant, but through the natural breeding process. And so my question is, do people, consumers in general, understand the distinction between the natural breeding process versus an actual DNA insertion into an organism that is truly genetically modified, whether they insert a transgene from another organism, knock out an existing gene in that organism, or turn on or knock in, insert a specific gene in that organism. Is there that distinction globally? Do people understand
They're
that?
getting there,
Yes.
because where the consumer comes from is their health and their medical issues.
So I guess my question is more from a GMO labeling standpoint. Is there that distinction in the current definition of GMO versus natural breeding selection?
I don't think there's really an absolute arbiter, because it boils down to the propaganda. When either side is discussed, the pro-modification side will say, this is exactly what we've been doing for centuries. But it's not. the insertion thing is a brand new
Right.
technology.
Right.
But we have been improving crops, and we have been, for instance, using colchicine to double the DNA, and that's really not ever ended up in any of the discussion either. So there has been a kind of modification. It hasn't been a gene insertion, but it has been a non-natural modification that goes back, how long does that go back? 50 or 60 years?
I was going to say 30, 40, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a long
decades.
time ago. So that's kind of like in the middle there as well. So that's not growing corn A and corn B in the field and having them pollinate and then go and killing all the A's and then harvesting the B's. That's hybridization, the way that Henry Wallace Sr. invented it. But that's not what consumers recognize.
What I found in my research was that was interesting was conventionally bred, let's say corn, but they use mutagenesis. They expose the seeds to radiation and carcinogenic chemicals to force genes to mutate, and then they breed them together and see what happens.
But there's no insertion, so it wouldn't meet this commonly understood definition. Is that your point?
Exactly. There's no insertion, but to me that's more dangerous. You don't know what's in there.
Right.
Yeah, it looks like a
It's
beautiful
mutating, right?
tomato or a beautiful ear of corn, but I mean, what kind of longitudinal study can make sure it's all the other mutated genes in there won't interact?
Right.
Or
You really know what's in
Right.
there before that anyway.
As far as due diligence is concerned, then it would be important to go back and look at the food crops that are produced by radiation. There's only like a handful of them, like 20 or 30 of them that are on the market that were produced by radiation mutation. And do the toxicity studies and see if there is some negative effects from those mutations.
But personally, as a consumer, I found that more alarming than actually knowing the loci of the alleles and inserting them into another gene. I thought
Well, from
that
the
was more
consumer
troubling than
perspective,
GMO.
one book that's really popular is Wheat Belly, which is written by an MD. And he does, because as we know, there's more and more gluten intolerances and sensitivities being diagnosed. And so he does touch on that book about wheat and how it has been genetically altered through intensive hybridization, tens of thousands of times. So I know a lot of people in the public read things like that, at least.
And that's called wheat belly?
Wheat Belly.
So I would love to have a seminar, so I'm looking for experts that is, because I hear a lot about, I myself am gluten intolerant or gluten, whatever, adverse. And a lot of people are, and yet there's a lot of controversy about that, I know. But I hear in the public a lot people saying, well, GMOs have caused your condition and that condition. And I think that would be a great thing to unpack and, really look at the state of the art of, we did have one already, and Joni, I forgot to mention, Joni and Ron both presented on our label. What was it called? The panel was it on GMO labels specifically?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so we had a really exciting panel. I think we probably need to do another one. But the point is that there's a lot of unknowns, and Greg, you've talked about the belly, I think there's a lot going on right now about
What do you say?
the belly. Yeah. We all have one. But these microbiology cultures, what's going on? How are those evolving?
Right.
The
Microbiome, yeah. Oh, microbiome.
And if anybody is interested in Stephanie Sena's work, if you go to Google, YouTube, Stephanie Sena's Seed of Truth, or Seeds of Truth, I think, plural. It is an hour and a half lecture that she gives.
And by the way, I hope I was clear. My understanding is GMOs absolutely do not cause gluten intolerance. There may be 100 things that cause it, but that's probably the least. But I think that's what we would unpack, right?
Well, yeah, and so much is behavioral. I mean, I read a statistic that since the 1970s, American diet has 25% more carbohydrates in it. That's just doesn't.
That is shocking, because I think of us as eating more meat nowadays.
Yeah, and that's at the top level. That's at the behavioral
Yeah.
level. That's nothing Steve can do. Or nothing the Steves can do to change that. It's human behavior.
instance.
No, sugar tastes good. And
That's why it's
a friend of mine a long time ago said
Good stuff.
if we weren't supposed to eat fat, then God wouldn't have made it taste so good.
That's true.
That's true. Yeah, and that would be another great panel. I think a lot of is our food heritages and the whole paleo diet controversy. What is our ancestral food? What foods are we physically adapted to eat? We're primates. We're omnivorous primates. But what foods are healthiest for us? What our bodies are adapted to run on and maladapted?
Or what are the ones that we've eaten the longest?
Right.
Because when you look at these populations that are at risk because they're suddenly eating foods that are exposed to in the last 50, 60 to 100 years, and now there's all the, like for instance, diabetes.
Right, like the Pima Indians, a lot of the Native Americans, all of a sudden.
And they don't seem to be, that doesn't seem to affect folks who have been grown up with it more. But you know, a lot of these things that we're now identifying as being significantly negative, we haven't had sugar consumption except since the 17th and 18th century, when sugar cane as an export ended up being a colonial, moneymaker.
Sugar didn't hit Europe until like 1200, and it was a very elite substance. Or only royals. I mean, the common person, all of us in this room, unless you have royal blood in you, would just probably never even taste sugar. And we probably all relive skiing.
What things are we still eating today that are no longer suitable, that might have been suitable 10,000 years ago, but really we shouldn't be eating anymore because our bodies have changed and they may adapt for us. And maybe gluten is one of those things. I don't know. There may be certain things.
The thing is that what we eat today is radically different.
Sure, but we're different too.
10,000 years ago, and actually that's true for most of our food. Genetically, it's dramatically different.
Yeah.
I agree. And then we have, people who have ancestors in different, like the Inuit, many of them never even tasted a green thing in their entire lives up until industrialization, and they are very healthy and robust. What processes did they do with their meat diet that allowed them to get all those nutrients and antioxidants?
Well, one of the things they did is
process and culture, not just chemistry.
they would kill a moose and slit open its gut and eat the stomach contents of the moose was grazing on.
That is hunger.
Come again?
That is hunger.
It's nutrition, because they were eating the processed food stuff that the
pre-digested
moose was eating, so they were getting their greens kind of like a secondary
casserole.
Moose soup. Moose green soup. That's right.
Did you get your question answered?
I did, yeah. I mean, I think it's. Okay. All right, the seminar is over, so you guys are here just to hang out. I don't think. We don't want to leave that. Yeah.